7 weeks. For 7 weeks, Maggie Sullivan had poured sweat into bringing a 1961 Lincoln Continental back from the dead. Yet when she stood at the workshop gates, the men in expensive suits framed her as a thief and burst out laughing when she demanded her money. "You actually thought we'd pay you?" They had woven a perfect net of lies to cover up their own deadly fraud. They were certain that after a night of desperation, this exhausted single mother would bow her head, sign their fraudulent safety logbook, just to get her life savings back, and swallow the humiliation, because people like her had always been made to swallow it. But when Crane called her in the dead of night to strike that dirty deal, Maggie did not hesitate. She refused to sign her name to a death sentence, leaving the blank logbook behind and choosing her dignity over their blood money. The next morning, Dexter Crane snapped out an order to take the car away in time for the showing before the city's elite. But every driver who stepped toward the Lincoln stopped short. They opened the restoration logbook, looked at the final line left blank, then backed away and said the very same thing. Until the woman who had uncovered the truth signed her name, no one would dare touch the keys, because she alone knew what was lying silent inside that machine. And it was enough to take a life. If you believe a person's dignity should never be put up for bargain, stay until the very last minute and watch the truth come to light. 7 weeks before that humiliating afternoon, no one in Baltimore's classic car collecting circles knew the name Maggie Sullivan, and she didn't need anyone to know it. In the small garage at the end of a dead-end street, where the smell of motor oil mingled with the scent of cold metal and had become the very air she breathed every day, people only saw her legs sticking out from beneath the belly of an old car. The worn heels of her work boots braced against the stained concrete floor. The wrench turned steadily, slowly, decisively. She was in no hurry. Hands that knew what they were doing never hurried. Maggie was past 28, her body full and heavy in the way of a woman who had given birth and then forgotten how to care for herself because there were too many other things to worry about. Her hands were calloused, her fingernails always carrying a black rim no scrubbing could ever fully erase. And that was all most people needed to know about her at first glance. But what lived inside her head was something else entirely. She could listen to an engine running for only a few seconds and tell exactly where it was hurting, like an old doctor pressing his ear to a patient's chest and guessing the root of the illness with quiet certainty. That gift was rare, so rare that even the most seasoned mechanics in the area had to call her whenever they came across a machine that left them helpless. That morning, the old phone vibrated across a tabletop scattered with metal shavings. She slid out from under the car, wiped her hands on a rag already blackened beyond saving, then pressed the phone to her ear. The man's voice on the other end was smooth, as if it had been rehearsed, and he introduced himself as Dexter Crane, the collection manager for a client whose name he was not at liberty to disclose. He said there was a 1961 Lincoln Continental in need of restoration, a jewel that had been sitting under dust for nearly 2 years, and that the 3 most reputable shops in the city had all turned it down because the timeline was too tight. He had heard she was the kind of person who could do what others couldn't. His voice lingered over the words payment, higher than any contract she had ever taken. Maggie stayed silent for a moment. She glanced toward the stack of papers clipped at the corner of the table, where a brown envelope lay face down because she had deliberately turned it over so she wouldn't have to see the bank's bold printed notice. The mortgage on her small house was 2 months overdue. They had called 3 times, each call colder than the one before. The amount Crane had just mentioned would be enough for her to pay off everything she owed, with a little left over. And that little was more precious than gold to her right now. She closed her eyes, and in her mind appeared the small face waiting for her at home. She asked a few questions about the condition of the car, about the restoration records, about who would be responsible for approving replacement parts. Crane answered quickly, a little too quickly, the way a man answers when he wants to hang up before more questions can be asked. There was something in his voice that sent a faint ripple down her spine, an instinct that more than 10 years spent lying beneath cars had sharpened in her, that vague feeling that some bolt somewhere had been tightened the wrong way. But then she thought of the brown envelope, thought of the bank's phone calls, thought of those waiting eyes, and she pushed that instinct aside. Bonnie Foster, the woman who had shared this garage with her for 11 years, lifted her head from the workbench on the other side, her eyebrows rising into a question. Maggie only gave a small nod, the kind of nod made by someone who had just decided to step through a door without being able to see clearly what lay beyond it. She told the man on the phone that she would take the job, that she would come look at the car that very afternoon. Crane laughed, a laugh so pleased it sounded almost slick. then read her the address. When the call ended, Maggie stood still for a long time in the middle of her familiar garage, her hand still gripping the phone even though the screen had gone dark, and for the first time in months, she allowed herself to believe that maybe everything would be all right. She had no idea that the nod she had just given had pulled her into the orbit of people whose names the city's underworld spoke only by lowering its voice. That afternoon, before driving her old pickup to the address Crane had read to her, Maggie stopped by home for a little while, because that small house was the only reason her hands never allowed themselves to give up. The moment she pushed the door open and stepped inside, she heard the patter of small feet across the wooden floor, and then a girl of 7 rushed out and wrapped her arms around her mother's legs, her 2 pale blonde braids bouncing, her eyes shining as though the whole long day had existed only for this very moment. Daisy held up a sheet of paper, still smeared with crayon, showing mother and daughter standing beside a huge red car, with a crooked sun above them sending out slanted rays of light, and the little girl announced solemnly that it was a gift for her mother, so she could stick it on the refrigerator like all the other pictures. Maggie took the drawing with both hands, her skin still carrying the smell of motor oil, and for one brief moment, every burden pressing down on her shoulders suddenly became weightless, as if the whole world had shrunk to fit inside the gap-toothed smile of her little girl. She bent down and kissed her daughter's forehead, asked about school, listened as Daisy told her about the neighbor's cat and about the child at the next desk who had shared half a cookie with her. And Maggie laughed along with every tiny story, as if they were the most important things in the world, because to her, they truly were. Mrs. Helen, the elderly neighbor, who watched Daisy whenever Maggie went to the garage, gently drew her out onto the porch after the child had run off to find her box of crayons, and in the tender voice every mother dreads hearing, she repeated the thing Maggie hadn't slept peacefully through a single night since learning. Daisy's small heart had a congenital defect, something the child had carried with her from the moment she was born, and so far, it had still been strong enough for her to run, to laugh, to draw crooked suns. But the doctors had made it clear that the little girl needed surgery, and that surgery couldn't be postponed forever. The longer they waited, the narrower the window of hope would become. The problem wasn't whether it could be done, but the number written on the estimate the hospital had given her, a number so large that every time Maggie thought about it, her throat tightened. It was the kind of money a hired restoration mechanic like her could hardly gather, even if she worked herself to the bone day and night for an entire year. That number was exactly why the brown envelope from the bank had become so frightening, because it wasn't only debt. It was the roof over mother and daughter's heads, waiting to be taken away. That number was exactly why Dexter Crane's phone call that morning, with a payment higher than any contract she had ever known, had appeared in her mind not as a job, but as a rope thrown down to someone floundering in a violent current. Maggie stood on the porch and looked through the window, where Daisy was bent over, carefully coloring a new picture, and she told herself that she would do it, that she would restore that Lincoln perfectly down to the last bolt, that she would take that money with her head held high, and that she would bring her daughter to the hospital without shame. She didn't allow herself to think of any other possibility, because when a mother stands at the line between life and death for her child, there's no room left for fear, only for will. When she knelt down to say goodbye to her daughter, before heading back to the garage, Daisy clung to her mother's collar and whispered, asking whether Mama would be home in time to read her a story tonight, and Maggie promised firmly that she would, a promise she told herself she had to keep at any cost. Satisfied, the little girl let go, waving the picture of the sun as though she were waving a flag, and that image followed Maggie the whole drive to the meeting place, imprinted in her mind more deeply than any signboard passing along the road. She didn't know that the place she was about to enter was hiding a secret that could swallow every one of those promises, and that the kindness and integrity she carried inside her would soon be placed on the scale against the very life of the child she loved most. The address Crane had given led Maggie to a warehouse district set apart on the edge of the city, where rows of high concrete walls closed everything in, and an iron gate stood open just wide enough for her pickup to slip through. A silent man led her inside, asking no questions, offering no greeting, only giving a slight jerk of his head toward the far end of the vast workshop. And it was there, beneath a canvas cover yellowed by the dust of time, that the 1961 Lincoln Continental waited for her like some enormous beast, sunk deep in sleep. When the cover was pulled away, Maggie held her breath for a moment, because even beneath nearly 2 years of thick dust, the car still carried the solemn majesty of an era long gone. Its long, flat body lines, its 4 distinctive reverse-opening doors that people in the trade still called by an affectionate name. But that sense of admiration lasted only a few seconds, because the eyes inside her, eyes used to reading every tendon and vein of machinery, immediately recognized that something was wrong, a vague misalignment no outsider would ever have noticed. Maggie pulled the small flashlight from her shirt pocket, opened the hood, and the more she examined it, the colder her spine became. This car wasn't simply a machine neglected by time. It was a machine someone had touched, and touched with a carelessness so severe it was almost hard to believe. There were bundles of wiring that had been half removed and then abandoned, loose ends hanging down without being properly reconnected, as if someone had started a job and stopped halfway through for some reason no one wanted to explain. There were bolts forced in with crossed threads, and there were connections wrapped hastily in cheap tape no self-respecting classic car restorer would ever dare to use. And when she ran her hand down to the assembly related to the braking system, her fingers froze over a part that looked unfamiliar, a component that carried no manufacturer serial number, no engraved mark of origin, a replacement piece she was almost certain wasn't genuine equipment for a car this valuable. She hadn't removed it yet. She hadn't tested anything at all, but the instinct that had first stirred inside her when she heard Crane's voice over the phone had now become a wrong note ringing through her mind. Maggie turned and asked the silent man about the restoration file, the documentation that recorded the entire repair history of the car, the kind of record any expensive machine should have. He hesitated, then brought out a packet of papers so thin it was suspicious, and as Maggie turned each page under the light, she realized it was systematically incomplete. Many important sections had been left blank. Many stages of repair hadn't been recorded at all, as if someone had deliberately torn away the pages that might have exposed something. A properly cared-for machine should have a thick and transparent file, every replaced component backed by an invoice, every removal and installation marked with a signature, and yet the papers in her hands were so empty and disjointed that it made no sense. She began to understand why Crane had come to a small, unknown garage like hers, and why he had mentioned that the 3 most reputable shops in the city had all turned the job down. Those larger shops had strict procedures, independent inspection teams, and sharp eyes that would have spotted the irregularities at once and asked questions someone didn't want to hear. But a woman working alone, drowning in debt, desperate enough to need every dollar of pay, was, in their calculation, far easier to manage. She would lower her head and do the job without asking too much. Maggie straightened, wiped her hands on her pant leg, and looked at the Lincoln with an entirely different gaze from the one she had carried when she first walked in. She still didn't know the whole truth. She still couldn't give a name to the danger hiding inside this machine. But more than 10 years of professional instinct told her she had just stepped into something far larger than an ordinary restoration contract. One part of her whispered softly that she should turn around and leave, that this money wasn't as clean as it appeared. But then Daisy's face appeared again, along with the crooked sun drawing and the enormous number on the hospital estimate, and Maggie knew she didn't have the luxury of turning back. She tightened her grip on the strap of her tool bag, drew a deep breath of the damp air thick with dust and metal in that unfamiliar workshop, and quietly set to work, without knowing that every bolt she was about to touch was leading her closer to a deadly secret. While Maggie was bent over the Lincoln in the warehouse district on the edge of the city, not far away, on the highest floor of a glass tower overlooking Baltimore Harbor, the true owner of that car sat behind a dark wooden desk, silent as a predator watching over his territory. Roland Hale was only a little over 34, but the way men twice his age lowered their voices whenever they spoke his name said everything about his place, in a world that the law often tiptoed around. He didn't need to speak loudly. He didn't need to make a show of himself, because real power never had to shout in order to be heard. A single glance from him sweeping across the room was enough to make the men seated there hold their breath, and when he spoke, each word fell slowly, evenly, cold as the surface of steel. That day, standing before him in the middle of the room was a trembling man, one of his own subordinates, who had been caught skimming money from an elderly woman selling goods in a neighborhood under Roland's protection, then had raised his hand and threatened her when she dared to resist. Roland didn't slam his fist on the desk. He didn't harden his voice. He simply rose, walked around the desk, and stepped close enough to the man for him to feel the frightening stillness that radiated from him. He said that within his territory, there were lines that must never be crossed, and that a man who oppressed someone weaker than himself, a man who bullied an old woman with no way to defend herself, was the kind of person he despised more than any enemy outside these walls. He gave a signal, and his men quietly led the man away, without one unnecessary sound, without any scene that needed to be displayed, leaving only the thick, heavy air behind, an air everyone in the room understood to mean that the name Roland Hale was not something to be treated lightly. Afterward, he ordered his people to bring the elderly vendor a sum many times greater than what she had lost, along with a message that from now on, no one would ever dare touch her again. That was his law, a law merciless toward traitors and those who use strength to crush the weak, yet strangely protective of the voiceless, lowly people this world had long grown used to turning away from. When the room was empty, Roland walked to the glass window, and his sharp, cold eyes softened for one rare moment, because on his desk sat an old framed photograph of a man leaning against a deep red Lincoln Continental, smiling beneath the sun. That was his father, the man who had built everything from nothing, the man who had taught him that strength only had meaning when it was used to protect, not to trample, and the man who had loved that car more than any other possession in his life. To Roland, the Lincoln wasn't merely a machine. It was the last remaining fragment of memory from a father who had passed away, the silent witness to afternoons when father and son had sat inside it and talked about life back when Roland was still a boy. When his father died, the car had been badly damaged and stored away for nearly 2 years, because every time Roland saw it, the wound inside him opened again. Only recently had he found the courage to hand it over to Dexter Crane, the property manager he had trusted for many years, with one command: to bring it back exactly as it had been when his father was alive, whatever the cost, in time for a memorial gathering he planned to hold. Roland placed his finger on the frame of the photograph, and inside him rose an absolute trust that everything was being handled properly, that Crane would never dare deceive him in a matter this important. He had no idea that at that very moment, beneath the polished shell of the car that carried the soul of his late father, a dangerous lie was already lying in wait, and that the only person with both the skill and the conscience to uncover it was the single mother he had never met, the woman quietly bending over that machine with a secret growing heavier in her calloused hands. 3 days after Maggie began the job, one morning, the deep, muffled engine of a luxury car sounded outside the gate of the warehouse district, and when the workshop door opened, she lifted her head from beneath the Lincoln and saw a man she had never met step inside, bringing with him an atmosphere that made the hired men around her suddenly straighten and fall silent. Maggie didn't know his name, but she could read power in every calm step he took, in the way Dexter Crane hurried forward to greet him, his voice sweet as poured honey, nothing like the slick, cold voice he used with her. Roland Hale walked straight to his father's car, his gaze sweeping once over the machine before coming to rest on the woman standing beside it with motor oil smeared across her skin. And in that instant, she saw undisguised doubt in his eyes, the look of a man accustomed to being served by the very best. Wondering why his treasure had ended up in the hands of someone so ordinary, he asked her in an even voice whether she knew what she had in her hands, and whether a small garage like this one was truly capable of doing what the most reputable shops had refused to do. The question carried the cold edge of contempt, and a woman drowning in debt like Maggie should have lowered her head and humbled herself to keep such a precious contract. But she didn't. She wiped her hands on the rag, looked straight into his eyes, and answered with a calm that surprised even herself, saying she didn't care why those other shops had refused. She only cared that this car was sick, and much sicker than what had been written in the file. Crane immediately cut in, his voice hurried, trying to brush her words aside as if dismissing the foolish talk of someone uneducated. But Roland raised one hand, and that single gesture was enough to silence him. He looked at Maggie more closely, for the first time, as though he had just realized this woman didn't fear him in the way almost everyone else knew to fear him. Maggie said nothing more. She simply motioned for him to come closer, then took the small flashlight and shone it into a deep, hidden corner of the engine compartment, a place where the naked eye would never have noticed anything unusual. She showed him a connection wrapped carelessly with cheap tape, a detail so small it seemed swallowed among hundreds of other parts, and she explained in plain but certain language that a connection like that on a machine this valuable should never have happened, that it was the trace of a hand that had deliberately done careless work, not the wear of time. She didn't rush to draw any grand conclusion. She didn't mention the word danger at all. She simply exposed the exact detail she had seen and let it speak for itself. Roland bent down and followed the beam of the flashlight, and though his face didn't change, Something faintly stirred behind those dark eyes, because he realized this woman had just shown him something that all the people paid to care for this car had missed, or worse, had deliberately hidden. He straightened, stood in silence for a long while, and the contempt he had first carried began to tremble, giving way to a vague, uneasy feeling he still couldn't name. He glanced quickly toward Dexter Crane, who stood there with a strained smile pasted on his mouth and a brief pallor he hurried to conceal. Then he turned back to Maggie, who remained calmly where she stood, showing neither triumph nor fear. He told her in a lower voice than before to continue the work, and to let him know anything else she found. It was no longer the command of an employer to a hired worker, but almost the request of a man who had begun to dimly realize that he might have placed his trust in the wrong hands. When Roland left the workshop, Maggie watched his back as he walked away, silently thinking that this powerful man would soon have to face a truth even she had not yet dared to fully imagine, and that the fate of two people from two separate worlds had just been quietly bound together by an invisible thread called the Lincoln of the Dead. After that morning, Roland Hale began coming to the warehouse district more often, and that made Dexter Crane restless, because never before had his boss personally watched over such a painstaking job. Roland didn't say much. Most of the time, he simply pulled out a chair and sat in a corner of the workshop, his hands folded together, silently watching that woman work for hours on end. He was a man used to reading people. He had survived and risen in the brutal underworld all his life because he could see through the person before him from only a few small gestures, and the more he watched Maggie, the more he felt there was something about her that kept him from looking away. She worked with a devotion money couldn't buy, bending for hours beneath the car without a single complaint, cleaning even the smallest parts with the tenderness of someone caring for a living being, and whenever she removed a component, she carefully recorded it in her own notebook, the one she kept with her and never let out of reach. Once, Roland broke the familiar silence between them with a question. He asked why she put so much effort into a car that wasn't hers, when she could simply finish the job, take the money, and leave like any other mechanic. Maggie didn't look up right away. She tightened the bolt she was still working on, then answered that a machine was much like a person. It didn't know how to lie, and if she lied to it, sooner or later it would betray whoever sat behind the wheel. To her, allowing one of her own mistakes to bring disaster upon someone else was something she could never forgive herself for. The answer was simple, but it left Roland silent for a while, because in the whole world of flatterers and liars surrounding him, it had been far too long since he had heard a person speak of their principles so calmly and so firmly, as though they were an obvious truth that needed no debate. He looked at her calloused hands, stained with motor oil, then lifted his gaze to that tired but steadfast face, and for the first time, he found himself curious about someone not because of what they could do for him, but because of who they were. As for Maggie, she wasn't unaware of that man's frequent presence, but she didn't let it disturb her work. She had caught bits and pieces of the hired men whispering about the name Roland Hale, about the world he ruled, and by all rights she should have been wary of him the way people were wary of fire. Yet the strange thing was that she didn't feel afraid, because through his blunt questions and quiet gaze, she sensed something different from the cruelty people spoke of, a loneliness carefully hidden behind the cold shell of power. One late afternoon, when she was struggling to lift a heavy component with no one there to help her, Roland quietly stepped forward and took one end without saying a word, and in that moment, as two people from two separate worlds leaned their shoulders into the same weight, something fragile and difficult to name flickered between them, then was quickly pushed aside by both of them, as though it had never existed. They said nothing more about that moment, and neither of them dared to acknowledge it, because between them lay a vast gulf of status, circumstance, and worlds that should never have crossed. Maggie returned to her work, and Roland went back to the chair in the corner, but from that day on, the way his eyes followed her had changed. It was no longer the doubtful gaze of an employer looking at a suspicious mechanic, but the gaze of a man slowly realizing that a person's true dignity had nothing to do with the clothes they wore or the money they possessed. He didn't yet know that the very toughness and rare honesty he had begun to quietly admire in this woman would soon be tested to its limit, and that the day when he would have to choose whether to stand beside her or turn his back on her was coming closer than he imagined, carrying with it a truth that could bring down the trust he had placed in the wrong hands for far too long. The deeper Maggie went into the restoration, the more she realized that the damaged parts inside the Lincoln needed to be replaced with genuine factory components, not the shoddy junk someone had secretly installed. And that was when she began running into the wall named Dexter Crane. Every time she submitted a request to purchase a proper replacement part, he found a way to delay it. Sometimes he claimed they had to wait for budget approval. Sometimes he said the supplier didn't have the part in stock yet. And sometimes he simply ignored her request form until it sank beneath a pile of paperwork. Yet, cruelly enough, he was also the very man who kept pressuring her to finish faster, because the private showing Roland planned to hold before the city's upper class in memory of his father was drawing near, and the car absolutely had to roll out on that exact day in its most flawless condition. Maggie was trapped between two absurd jaws, one demanding that she work quickly, the other blocking the very things she needed in order to do the job right, and she was perceptive enough to understand that this contradiction wasn't ordinary negligence. It was a deliberate scheme meant to force her to close her eyes, throw something together, and call it finished. Faced with that dead end, Maggie made a decision she would later pay dearly for. She used her own money to buy the necessary genuine parts, ordering them directly from trusted suppliers she had known through many years in the trade. She did it because she couldn't bear the thought of installing an unreliable part in a machine someone would sit inside and drive away, and because she believed that once everything was complete, she would submit the invoices and be reimbursed fairly. But that money wasn't spare cash. It was the very amount she had scraped and saved for so long, every dollar and every coin set aside for the day she would take Daisy to the hospital. And each time she pulled out her wallet to pay for a shipment, a slow, aching worry twisted inside her. She reassured herself that this was only an advance, that she would soon get it back, and that the generous payment from this contract, together with the reimbursement, would be more than enough to make up for everything. She didn't allow herself to imagine the opposite, because imagining it was more than a mother could endure. Bonnie Foster, the coworker who had stood beside her for 11 years, was the only person who understood the true cost of what Maggie was doing. Bonnie didn't say much, because she knew her friend's nature, knew Maggie would never accept pity. But quietly, she slipped some of her own savings into Maggie's toolbox, along with a small note containing only a few words, saying it was an interest-free loan, to pay back when she had time, and not to worry if she didn't. When Maggie found that money, she stood motionless for a long while in the garage, her throat tightening, because in a world full of people waiting for a chance to use her, there was still one person willing to share the little she had, even though she had no abundance herself. Maggie didn't say thank you, because between two women who understood each other that deeply, thank you was unnecessary. She only held Bonnie's hand tightly for a long time, and both of them understood. Meanwhile, on the other side, Dexter Crane was quietly weaving a net of lies around Roland Hale. Whenever Maggie sent reports about the true condition of the car, about the fake parts she had discovered, and the expenses needed to fix them, Crane was the middleman who passed the information along, and by the time it reached Roland's ears, everything had been twisted beyond recognition. He painted the picture of a greedy female mechanic, deliberately exaggerating the damage to squeeze out more money, demanding unreasonable expenses, and dragging out the work in suspicious ways. With skillful care, he planted doubt in Roland's mind against the very person who was struggling to save his father's car, taking advantage of the exact prejudice Roland had once held toward her. Maggie had no idea that every honest word of hers was being distorted by an unseen hand into evidence against her, and that the pit Crane was digging beneath her was growing deeper by the day, waiting only for the right moment to shove her into it. The vague instinct that had followed Maggie for many days finally crystallized into a terrible truth one night, when she stayed at the workshop later than usual, after she decided to completely remove the strange component in the braking and steering system and inspect it to the very end. Under the beam of her flashlight, she realized that the untraceable part wasn't merely low-quality junk installed just to fill a space. It had been manufactured with incorrect technical specifications, made from a cheap material that couldn't withstand the pressure and heat a proper braking system was supposed to bear. With more than 10 years of experience behind her, she understood at once what that meant. As long as the car remained still or moved slowly around the yard, everything would look perfect, with not a single abnormal sign showing itself. But at the exact moment the machine was pushed to high speed for the first time, when the heat and force pressing onto that assembly reached the critical point, that fake part wouldn't hold, and the system meant to make the car obey the steering wheel and pedal would betray the person behind the wheel at the very second they needed it most. Maggie sank down onto the cold workshop floor, feeling her legs begin to shake, because she had just understood that what she was holding in her hands was no different from a time bomb, a deadly trap disguised beneath the polished appearance of an antique jewel. And what made her blood run cold was that she knew when this car would roll out. It would run on the very day of the grand showing before the city's upper class. The day Roland Hale planned to bring the machine carrying his late father's soul back to life before hundreds of watching eyes, perhaps with Roland himself behind the wheel in remembrance. She pictured the Lincoln gliding forward under the glow of admiration, then suddenly no longer answering to human control, and that image made it impossible for her to breathe. This was no longer about a restoration contract. This was about lives, and not just one life, but possibly many lives among the crowd standing there to watch. With hands that trembled but still fought to remain steady, Maggie began doing what her professional instinct told her to do. She built a meticulous file around what she had found. She photographed the fake part from every angle, carefully wrote every incorrect specification into the notebook she always carried with her, and compared it against the official technical documents for that model to prove clearly where the deadly abnormality lay. She did all of it quietly in the night, because some instinct warned her that she was holding a secret someone would be willing to do anything to keep from ever being exposed. As the file slowly took shape, an even more bitter truth began to appear before her eyes, placing her before one of the cruelest choices a human being could ever face. Because if she chose silence, if she simply signed her name on the final line of the restoration log confirming that the car was perfect and ready to drive, then she would receive the full generous payment, would be reimbursed for everything she had advanced from her own pocket, and that would be more than enough to take Daisy to the hospital immediately, to save her little girl's fragile heart before it was too late. Just one signature, one moment of closing her eyes and looking away, and the child she loved more than life itself would be saved. But the price of that signature would be the lives of the strangers who would get into this car, the life of the very man who had begun to look at her differently. And if she spoke up and told the truth, she would be standing against powerful people who would stop at nothing. She would lose the contract, lose the money that could save her child, and perhaps lose everything. Maggie sat there in the empty workshop in the depth of the night, the file heavy in her hands, torn between motherhood and conscience. And she understood that whichever path she chose, her heart would break in a way nothing could ever mend. But Dexter Crane was an old fox, and with the sharp instinct of a man used to living inside lies, he had sensed that this woman knew too much, that she had touched the very secret he had buried beneath the shell of the Lincoln. He understood that as soon as Maggie opened her mouth and told Roland the truth, the entire fraud he had built over nearly 2 full years would collapse. And when that happened, the price he would have to pay would be more terrible than anything. So instead of waiting for her to strike, Crane decided to move first, and he did it in the cruelest way a man with both power and money could. One morning, when Maggie had just arrived at the warehouse district, she froze at the sight of several strange men standing in front of the workshop, blocking the way, and then Crane stepped out with a crooked smile and a stack of papers in his hand, loudly declaring that she had been caught stealing expensive parts from the car and deliberately damaging it in order to extort its owner. Maggie went dead still, unable to believe her own ears, because the truth had been turned upside down so brazenly that she didn't even know how to react. She was the one who had spent her own money, buying real parts to save the car, and yet now she was being accused of stealing the very things she had paid for herself. Crane held out forged invoices, carefully fabricated reports, even statements from several hired men who had already been bought off and were ready to testify that they had seen her secretly swapping parts and damaging the car's components with their own eyes. The net of lies had been laid so systematically that even the clearest-headed outsider might have believed that this woman stained with motor oil truly was a thief. Crane had used her own poverty as a weapon against her, because in the eyes of the world, what was easier to believe than a desperate single mother drowning in debt being willing to steal when given the chance? And he did not stop there. Crane ordered the entire workshop sealed, and that was the most vicious blow of all, because with the sealing order, he had his men confiscate everything inside, including the car, the parts, and most importantly, the file and photographs Maggie had worked so hard to build through the night. All the evidence of the deadly fake component, everything that could have proven the truth and her innocence, was in the enemy's hands in the blink of an eye. Maggie rushed forward, trying to take back her notebook, but the men blocked her, and all she could do was stand there helplessly, watching all her effort and the only weapon she had to defend herself being carried away. She still held the truth in her mind. She still knew exactly what danger was hiding inside the car. But now she didn't have a single piece of evidence left in her hands to prove it. And what weight could the words of someone just accused of theft possibly carry before powerful people? In one morning, Maggie had lost everything. She lost the contract, and with it, the payment she had been counting on. She lost the large amount of money she had advanced to buy parts. The money meant to save Daisy's little heart, now gone with no hope of getting it back. And more painfully than anything, she lost her honor. The only possession a poor mechanic like her had spent her whole life protecting, because from now on, the story of a woman who stole and sabotaged would spread through the trade, slamming every door of work shut before her. Crane watched as she was led out through the warehouse gate with the cold, triumphant eyes of a man who had just completed a perfect move, certain that this miserable woman had been crushed completely, certain that she would never again have the strength to rise and threaten his secret. And Maggie stood outside the iron gate that had slammed shut behind her, beneath the gray sky, and for the first time in all the years she had spent carrying life's burdens on her back, she felt the ground beneath her feet collapse entirely, and the darkness of despair began to close over her. That evening, Maggie came home with her shoulders heavier than ever, but when she placed her hand on the doorknob, she paused for a beat, drew a deep breath, and wiped the dazed emptiness from her face, because she knew that behind that door was a pair of eyes that must never be allowed to see her mother collapse. Sure enough, the moment she stepped inside, Daisy cried out and ran to her, proudly showing her that she had finished coloring the picture of the red car, and had even added Mama standing beside it with a smile. Then the little girl chattered brightly and asked whether Mama liked it. Maggie knelt and gathered her child into her arms, smiling as she praised the picture for being beautiful, her voice still warm and steady as it was every day, revealing not even the smallest trace of the storm howling inside her. She read her daughter a bedtime story as promised, sitting beside the bed and stroking that pale blonde hair until the child's little breaths settled evenly into sleep. And only when the room had fallen into quiet darkness did she allow herself to sit silently on the front step and face the naked truth that now she had no idea where she could possibly find the money to save the heart of the child sleeping. Inside, she sat there for a long time in the night, not crying, because tears were a luxury mothers like her had forgotten long ago. She only turned every possible road over and over in her mind, and every road led to a wall. The savings had vanished with the confiscated parts. Her honor had been smeared, the job was gone, and the hospital door she had once believed she was about to push open had slammed shut right in front of her. It was at the very moment she touched the deepest bottom of that helplessness that her phone vibrated, and on the other end came Dexter Crane's familiar, oily voice. He no longer had the aggression of that morning, but had changed to a dangerously sweet tone, like a snake spitting venom wrapped in sugar. He said he understood her difficult situation, that he did not want to drive a mother into a corner, and that he was willing to offer her a way out. That way out was laid before her by Crane with meticulous and calculating care. He said every accusation of theft and sabotage could be erased immediately. Her honor would be restored completely, and more than that, she would receive a large sum of money, far greater than the original payment, enough not only to pay off all her debts, but also to leave plenty for her most urgent private needs. In return, she only had to do one very simple thing. She had to put her signature on the final line of the restoration log, confirming that the Lincoln was perfect and absolutely safe to drive, then leave quietly afterward and forget everything she had seen. Crane added, with a subtly threatening shift in his voice, that this was the last and best chance she could ever have, that an intelligent woman who knew how to care for her child would understand what the right choice was. He had placed the most precious thing in her life on the scale, and he was certain that no mother in the world could refuse when her own child was standing on the line between life and death. Maggie held the phone to her ear, and in that moment, the whole world seemed to fall silent, waiting for her answer. She thought of Daisy sleeping in the room, of that little heart waiting day by day for a miracle, of the money sitting only one signature away from her. One signature, and her child would be saved. But then she also thought of the strangers who would sit inside that car, of the crowd who would stand watching at the showing, of the man who had once silently put his shoulder under a weight to help her, and of the deadly truth that only she held. She understood that if she signed her name, she would save her child, but she would trade that salvation for the lives of innocent people, and she would have to live the rest of her days with other people's blood on her hands, teaching her daughter about kindness, with a conscience that had already died. And Maggie, the woman who had lost almost everything in the world, realized that there was still one thing she couldn't allow herself to lose, and that was the person she was. She tightened her grip on the phone, and in a voice strangely calm, without trembling, without hesitation, she refused. She told Crane that she would never sign her name to a death sentence for innocent people, no matter what price she had to pay. Then she hung up and sat alone in the darkness, shattered but not defeated, because she knew she had just kept the only thing that would still let her look straight into her daughter's eyes. After pushing Maggie out of the game, Dexter Crane believed every obstacle had been cleared away, and he hurried through the final steps to present the Lincoln on schedule, because with that stubborn woman neutralized, he thought there was no one left who could stand in his way. It was also the fateful morning the beginning of the story had already revealed. The morning when Crane barked an order for the car to be taken out of the workshop in time for the showing, and one driver after another stepped forward, only to freeze before the blank signature line in the restoration log. But among the people called in to drive the car that day, there was one man whose words carried a weight Crane had failed to anticipate. His name was Walter Pike, the veteran test driver who had been tied to the Hale family since Roland's father was still alive. Walter was an older man, quiet by nature, a man who had spent his whole life behind the wheels of the most expensive machines. And in the trade, his name meant absolute reliability, because he had never once lied about the condition of a car, even when the truth displeased someone. When Walter was asked to test drive the Lincoln before it was taken to the showing, he did not rush into the driver's seat like the others. Instead, he opened the hood, quietly inspected, listened, placed his hands on each part with the sensitivity of a man who had lived his entire life with machinery, and the longer he looked, the deeper the lines gathered across his brow. He did not have Maggie's extraordinary gift for diagnosis, but several decades of experience had given him an instinct sharp enough to know that something inside this machine was not right, some vague misalignment he could not name, but one strong enough to raise the hairs at the back of his neck. And then Walter did the one thing none of Crane's people dared to do. He flatly refused to drive the car. He lowered the hood, took a step back, and declared with finality that he would not put his hands on the steering wheel of a machine he did not trust, that he had never done such a thing in his life, and had no intention of starting now. Despite Crane's clenched voice urging him on, despite the veiled threats, the old driver stood still as stone, because to him, a human life was not something to gamble with just to satisfy a manager. News that Walter Pike had refused to drive the car quickly reached Roland Hale, and it struck him in a way none of Crane's distorted reports ever could. Roland could doubt a strange woman mechanic he had only recently met. He could be persuaded that she was greedy and dishonest, just as Crane had painted her. But Walter Pike was different. That man had driven for his father, had lifted Roland onto the driver's seat when he was still a little boy, and had proven his honesty through decades without a single stain. When a man like that said there was something very wrong with the car, it was not the word of someone seeking profit, but the warning of a conscience Roland could not brush aside. For the first time since he had handed the Lincoln over to Crane, a seed of doubt was planted in Roland's heart, and it aimed itself directly at the very manager he had trusted for so long, not at the woman who had been falsely accused. Roland sat in silence inside his office, piecing together in his mind the scattered fragments he had ignored before. He remembered the day Maggie had shown him the carelessly wrapped connection everyone else had missed. He remembered her straightforward eyes, utterly without fear. He remembered the way she had spoken about how a machine never knew how to lie. Then he remembered Crane's excessive haste whenever the car was mentioned, and the way that woman had suddenly been thrown out under a theft accusation that had happened so quickly and so neatly it was suspicious. The things he had once believed to be obvious truths now began to appear beneath an entirely different light, full of cracks and contradictions. Roland rose, his eyes hardening with the familiar coldness of a predator who had just caught the scent of betrayal, and he understood that the time had come for him to uncover the truth himself, with all the power and all the networks he had in his hands, no matter where it led him or what it exposed. Roland Hale was not a man who acted on emotion, and once suspicion had begun to kindle, he set out to trace the truth in the methodical, cold-blooded way that had helped him survive and rule for so many years. The first step was to summon Walter Pike for a private meeting, and this time Roland did not ask careless, passing questions. He sat down and listened as the old driver recounted in full detail every feeling he had about the car, every detail that had made him uneasy, and Walter's plain-spoken description of the suspicious connections matched, with chilling precision, the very thing the woman mechanic had once tried to warn him about. The second step was for Roland to have his people quietly retrace, every expense record Crane had submitted over nearly 2 years in connection with the Lincoln's restoration, and when the numbers were spread beneath the light, a portrait of deceit slowly took shape. Crane had inflated the expenses many times over, had reported the purchase of expensive, genuine parts at outrageous prices, while in reality installing cheap, worthless, fake components in the car, and that enormous difference had flowed straight into his own pocket through a network of phantom invoices and false suppliers. The deeper Roland dug, the colder he felt, because he realized that Crane's betrayal did not stop at money. Roland's men tracked down the hired workers who had come forward to testify against Maggie, and under his pressure, several of them trembled as they confessed the truth, that Crane had paid them to make up the story, that the woman had never stolen or sabotaged anything, and that on the contrary, she had been the only one who had spent her own money to buy real parts in order to save the car. One piece after another fell into its rightful place, and the whole conspiracy appeared before Roland's eyes, naked and vile. Dexter Crane, the man he had trusted with the most sacred treasure of his life, had drained money from the very keepsake of his father, had installed something inside it that could kill anyone who drove it, and when an honest mechanic discovered the truth, he had not hesitated to destroy that woman's life and honor in order to silence her. But what made Roland's anger rise to an icy peak was the moment he connected the final link and understood what all of this truly meant for him. That car was being restored for the showing held in memory of his father, and by all ordinary expectation, he himself would be the one behind the wheel as the machine carrying his late father's soul rolled forward again. The fake component in the braking and steering system would betray the driver at the exact moment the car reached high speed, meaning that Crane, whether by accident or by design, had set a trap that could have taken Roland's own life, in his father's own car, on the very day he had set aside to honor him. The three most sacred lines in Roland's life had been trampled at once by a traitor: blood, trust, and life itself. And to a man like him, there was no sin more deserving of punishment. Roland sat for a long time in the darkness of the room, the framed photograph of his father beside the Lincoln placed before him, and inside him, the fury he felt toward Crane mingled with a deep sorrow and respect for the woman he had once doubted. He remembered the way Maggie had stood straight without fear, the way she had spoken of her principles as though they were a simple truth, and only now did he understand the price she had paid for that honesty. She had lost everything: her honor, her work, her money, only because she had refused to close her eyes to a deadly truth, only because she had refused to trade her conscience for her own safety. Roland rose, put on his coat, and decided that the first thing he needed to do was not to punish the traitor, but to find the woman to whom he owed not only an apology, but perhaps his very life. That night, a luxury car rolled through the city's poor streets, heading toward the small house where Maggie was sitting among the ashes of her life, never knowing that fate was about to turn to an entirely new page. When Roland appeared at the door of the small house in the middle of the night, Maggie froze, because she never could have imagined that a man with his kind of power would come personally to this place. He did not circle around the truth. He said plainly that he knew everything, that he knew she was innocent, that he knew about Crane's fraud and about the danger hidden inside the car, and that he needed her help to bring the truth into the light. He added, in a low, hoarse voice, rarely heard from a man like him, that he owed her an apology for having once doubted her. Maggie looked into his eyes for a long while, and what she read there was not pity or calculation, but the sincerity of someone who had just realized he had been wrong. She nodded, not because of the money or because her honor might be restored, but because to her, being able to speak the truth she had risked her entire life to protect mattered more than anything else. The next morning, at the warehouse district, Roland had ordered unsealed. A formal confrontation was arranged with all the important witnesses present, including Walter Pike, several independent technicians Roland had invited to ensure objectivity, and even the men Crane had once bought off, now standing off to one side with bloodless faces. Crane was also forced to be there. He still tried to maintain a calm appearance, but his darting eyes betrayed the fear inside him. Maggie did not waste words arguing with anyone. She quietly put on her familiar protective coveralls, picked up her toolbox, and walked to the Lincoln with the steady bearing of someone about to do exactly what she had done all her life. She knew that in this room, words no longer carried weight. Only truth revealed by her own hands could shatter every lie. Under dozens of eyes watching in tense silence, Maggie began taking apart the brake and steering assembly, each movement slow, precise, and decisive. With nothing excessive, and nothing missing. She loosened the bolts, removed each layer of shielding, and finally reached in and took out that fateful component, lifting it high so everyone could see it. Then she did the thing more persuasive than 1,000 defenses. She placed that fake part beside a genuine factory component she had brought for comparison, showing everyone the unmistakable differences in material, in workmanship, in every engraved mark, and she used measuring tools right there to prove how far its specifications deviated from the required standard. One of the independent technicians stepped forward to inspect it again, then nodded in confirmation, his face hardening as he understood the meaning of what he had just seen. Everything was recorded on video, photographed, measured, and carefully documented. And a new, undeniable file was built right before the eyes of credible witnesses. Maggie explained in plain language, anyone could understand that this part would survive every test as long as the car was crawling slowly. But it was destined to fail at the exact moment the machine surged forward at high speed, the exact moment when the driver entrusted his entire life to the control system. When those words rang through the room, Roland stood motionless, staring at the small component in the woman mechanic's hand, and a chill ran down his spine, because he understood that he was the one who would have been sitting behind the wheel of that car. That lifeless object, cleverly disguised beneath the splendid shell of a keepsake from his late father, had been arranged to become the place where his life ended. He looked over at Maggie, the woman who had lost everything simply because she refused to stay silent before this hidden death. And in that moment, every broken shard of doubt inside him vanished completely, replaced by a gratitude so deep no words could describe it. She had not known him. She had owed him nothing. Yet she had wagered her fate and her child's fate to save the lives of strangers, including his own. And Dexter Crane, standing tucked into the corner of the room with his face drained of every drop of blood, finally understood that the net of lies he had worked so hard to weave had been torn wide open, and that now he would have to face the wrath of a man the entire underworld of the city feared. When the confrontation ended, and the witnesses left one by one, Roland signaled for his men to keep Dexter Crane behind, and then he ordered everyone else out, leaving only the two men facing each other inside the vast warehouse, now sunken into silence. The last light of the day slanted through the high windows, casting long streaks across the concrete floor, and in that empty space, Crane stood there with sweat beading on his forehead, facing the man he had betrayed in the worst possible way. Roland did not hurry to speak. He only walked slowly closer, each footstep echoing evenly against the cement, like the countdown of an unavoidable fate. And it was that long silence that was the most terrifying thing of all, because it allowed the guilty man's imagination to draw every possible vision of horror for itself. Crane tried to salvage what he could. He began stammering excuses, blaming the supplier, blaming a misunderstanding, reaching for every possible reason to deny responsibility, his voice shrill and trembling, completely stripped of its usual smooth confidence. But Roland merely raised one hand, and Crane fell silent at once, because that single gesture carried an authority that choked every lie in his throat. Roland said, his voice low and even, colder than ice, that he had not come here to listen to any more lies, that he knew everything, every dollar siphoned off, every forged invoice, every witness who had been bought. He reminded Crane of the trust he had placed in him over so many years, of the way he had been valued and generously rewarded, and then he asked, in a voice that chilled Crane to the bone, whether he understood what he had touched. Roland stepped closer, and for the first time in that confrontation, his voice revealed the fury held beneath the ice. He said there were things in this life that a man like Crane should have known were untouchable. He had stolen from the sacred keepsake of Roland's father, had turned the last remaining memory of the dead into a filthy profit. He had installed a deadly trap that would have taken Roland's life on the very day he meant to honor his father. And when an honest woman discovered him, he had not hesitated to crush the life of a mother struggling to save her child, driving her into ruin and disgrace just to keep his crime hidden. Each sentence from Roland fell like a hammer blow, with no need for shouting, no need for a single wasted gesture. The truth alone, laid bare from his mouth, was enough to make Crane collapse. His legs no longer able to hold the weight of his terror, Crane began to beg. He dropped to his knees, pleading for mercy, promising he would return everything, that he would disappear from the city, that he would do anything to be spared. Roland looked down at the man trembling at his feet, and there was no satisfaction of victory in his eyes, only cold contempt for something small and cowardly. He told Crane that death would be too easy and too gentle for what he deserved. that he would not dirty his own hands in the way Crane feared. Instead, he would make him taste the very thing he had inflicted on others. He would strip Crane of everything he had, expose his crimes before the entire upper class and every business partner, turn him into an outcast with nowhere to go, with no one daring to shelter him, exactly as he had tried to turn Maggie into someone cast out by her entire trade. Roland turned and walked away, leaving Crane collapsed in the middle of the empty warehouse in utter despair, and the straight line of his back faded into the darkness, carrying a sentence that could not be appealed. Because in the world Roland Hale ruled, betrayal always had a price, and that price was decided not by fists, but by cold and absolute power. The showing Dexter Crane had once worked so carefully to build into a stage for his own ambition still took place exactly as planned, but it became a stage entirely different from anything he had ever imagined, because the one now directing it was Roland Hale. The city's upper class gathered in full inside a grand and glittering hall. Classic car collectors, powerful business partners, the very people Crane had spent so many years trying to please so he could climb higher on the ladder of prestige. Crane was required to be there, and he arrived with one last fragile thread of hope that perhaps Roland would preserve his dignity, that he would handle everything in discreet silence, the way people of their world so often did. But he was wrong, because Roland had no intention of granting him the mercy of discretion. In the middle of the gathering, when every eye turned toward him, Roland stepped forward and began to speak, and he spoke with a cold, steady calm that was more frightening than any outburst of rage. Before the entire upper class, he exposed every detail of Crane's scheme. He presented the ledgers recording the money that had been siphoned away, the forged invoices, the evidence of the deadly fake component installed in the car, and even the statements of the men Crane had bribed to frame an honest mechanic. Each word fell into the room like a shard of ice, and the crowd went silent in astonishment, then shifted into disgust as the full picture of betrayal appeared before their eyes. They looked at Crane, who was still standing there with a bloodless face, with eyes that only yesterday had held respect for him, now transformed into open contempt. Roland did not need to speak harshly. He only needed to let the truth speak for itself, and that truth was strong enough to crush Crane right in the middle of the crowd, where he had once longed to be respected. Roland's punishment did not stop at public humiliation. It was calculated to strip Crane of everything in a systematic way. According to the cold laws of the world Roland ruled, he used all his influence and his network of power to slam every door shut in the traitor's face. The business deals Crane had been pursuing collapsed at once, because no partner dared remain connected to a man Roland Hale had publicly exposed. The relationships he had spent years building evaporated overnight, and the people who had once flattered him now turned away as if avoiding a plague. The assets he had skimmed were traced and seized. The reputation he had built on lies crumbled into ash, and the powerful position he thought he had firmly in his grasp vanished as though it had never existed. Roland did not need to use a single act of violence. He simply pushed Crane out of the game, turning him into a man completely abandoned, with no money, no status, no place of refuge, forced to taste the very ruin and disgrace he had tried to pour over Maggie's head. And in the middle of that traitor's collapse, Roland did something he considered more important than punishment itself. He publicly cleared the name of the woman who had been falsely accused. Before the entire gathering of the upper class, he declared that every accusation against Maggie Sullivan had been fabricated, that she was not a thief or a saboteur as the rumors had claimed, but on the contrary, she was the one who had risked losing everything to uncover the truth and save the lives of innocent people. He said that this restoration mechanic possessed a kind of dignity money couldn't buy and power couldn't bend, a rare honesty worthy of the respect of the entire city. Those words, spoken from the mouth of a man everyone feared, swept away every stain from Maggie's honor and returned her to the place she deserved within her trade. Word began to spread about the woman who had dared stand against an entire force to protect her conscience, no longer as slander about a thief, but as admiration for a person of integrity, and from the ashes of disgrace that Crane had built around her, Maggie's honor rose again, whole and brighter than ever before. A few days after her honor had been fully restored, Roland came to Maggie's small house once again, but this time he did not come to ask for help or to apologize. He came to do what he believed a decent person had to do. He gave her the full payment for the restoration contract, reimbursed every dollar she had advanced to buy the real parts, and far more than that, a generous sum, he said, was the rightful reward for the courage that had saved his life and the lives of so many others. At first, Maggie tried to refuse the amount beyond what she felt she had earned, because her pride would not allow her to accept something she had not worked for. But Roland told her with sincerity in his voice that this was not charity. It was justice. And if there was anyone in this world who deserved that money, it was her. She looked at him, and this time she did not refuse, not because she had bowed to money, but because she could read true respect in his eyes, the kind she had never received before from people with power. But what truly moved Maggie's heart was not the money. It was what Roland had quietly done without telling her in advance. Somehow, he had learned about Daisy's little heart, about the surgery the child needed, about the hidden reason that had made this mother brace herself and endure everything. And he had silently arranged it all, contacting the best doctors, taking care of every cost, clearing a path so the little girl could receive treatment under the best possible conditions, without waiting another single day. When Maggie understood what he had done, she stood frozen, and for the first time in a very long while, her eyes burned, not from suffering, but from an emotion too deep to speak aloud. She was used to standing alone against the whole world. She was used to expecting no kindness from anyone, so much so that a gesture like this left her almost not knowing how to receive it. She only whispered, "Thank you." A simple thank you that carried everything a mother could ever owe. Daisy's surgery went smoothly, and before long, that little heart had grown strong again, so the child could run, laugh, play, and draw her crooked sun pictures without anything left to fear. On one beautiful sunny afternoon, Roland stopped by to visit, and Daisy, with the innocence of childhood, ran over to show the tall man her newest drawing. In it, there was a very big red car with 3 people standing beside it, holding hands and smiling together. Roland, the man the entire underworld of the city feared, the man who had never shown even a trace of softness before anyone, slowly lowered himself to one knee until he was level with the little girl, accepted the drawing with both hands, and on his usually cold face appeared a warm smile so unfamiliar that even he felt strange beneath it. In that simple moment, amid the clear laughter of a child, it could be seen that beneath that shell of power and ruthlessness, there was still a heart capable of being moved by goodness. When all the storms had passed, Roland offered Maggie a job working for him, proposing a place for her inside his organization, with compensation she had never dared dream of. A life no longer burdened by money worries. It was a generous offer, and in her situation, many people would have seized it without hesitation. But Maggie, after a moment of thought, gently but firmly shook her head and refused. She thanked him for everything, but she said that her small garage, stained with motor oil, though it was, poor though it was the place where she could be herself, where she could work with her hands and her conscience without depending on anyone. That independence, that right to live upright according to her own principles, was what made her who she was, and it was something no salary could ever buy. Roland looked at her, and instead of disappointment, he smiled with deep respect, because that answer once again confirmed the very thing he had admired in her from the beginning, that this woman would never trade herself away, not for money and not for power. After Maggie restored the Lincoln completely, this time with genuine factory parts fitted exactly where they belonged, she finally returned, picked up the pen, and placed it on the last blank line in the restoration log, the very line she had refused to sign so many days before, even though that refusal had cost her almost everything. This time, she signed it without a trace of hesitation, not because the money had been given to her, not because the powerful man was standing beside her, but for one reason only. The car was now truly safe. It was truly ready to carry the person behind its wheel home in peace. Her signature was no longer a formality. It was the promise of a conscience, the seal of someone who placed another human life above every calculation of her own. When Roland asked her why, back then, even when she had been driven into such a corner, she still refused to put her name down, Maggie looked up at him and answered in a simple but firm voice that people didn't hire her just to make an engine start and wheels turn. They hired her to make sure that when a person climbed into that car, they would still come home to the people waiting for them. That was the whole meaning of the work she did, and it was also the whole meaning of who she was. Those words stayed in Roland's heart for a very long time, because they held within them the very quality he had slowly learned to cherish in this woman, a quality he had rarely seen in a life surrounded by power and money. Between 2 people from 2 separate worlds, a quiet bond had formed, not a loud, impulsive kind of feeling, but a deep understanding and respect that grew with time, like a small seed taking root in the soil before slowly reaching upward. They did not speak it aloud, and neither of them needed to rush to define anything, because both understood that the most beautiful and lasting things in this world always need time to grow, and that between them now stood a solid foundation built from respect and trust, something more precious than any hurried promise. And the story of that woman stained with motor oil leaves each of us with a simple yet profound lesson, that a person's dignity is never found in appearances, in the clothes they wear, or in the money they carry in their pocket, but in the way they choose to act when standing before the harshest temptations and trials of life. A poor, lonely mother, looked down upon by the world, could still hold a kind of strength. Money couldn't buy, and power couldn't bend. The strength of honesty and quiet integrity. Sometimes, it is the smallest and quietest people who dare to stand the firmest against what is wrong, and the kindness we plant in this life, even in the darkest moments, will one day be answered by kindness in return, because goodness has never been a meaningless exchange. If this story has touched your heart, please click the like button, share this video with the people you love, and subscribe to our channel so we can continue listening together to many meaningful and compelling stories every day. How do you feel about Maggie's story? And if you were her in that desperate moment, would you have had the courage to choose as she did? Please leave a few lines in the comments so we can hear the honest emotions from deep within your heart. Thank you for listening until the very last moment. I sincerely wish you and your loved ones abundant health, and may every day that passes be filled with joy and peace within the soul. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you again in the next stories.